Welcome again if you have been listening to all or some of the first 4 parts of this series. Welcome also to those who are here for the first time. In this series we've been looking at different dimensions of distance, and our focus is to give some food for thought to leaders operating in the international sphere and having to handle one or many of the dimensions of distance constantly. We distinguish 4 dimensions of distance: geographical, cultural, language distance, and organizational or internal distance. Each of these requires your attention as a manager. In the episode on geographical distance, we've talked about how you connect in such a way that remote collaboration does not turn into something reduced, something that is only half as joyful or half as efficient as working in co-location. In part 3 about culture, we distinguished between being culture and doing culture and described practical ways of what doing culture could look like for remote leaders. Part 4 dealt with language, and here we talked about the various impacts of language differences on companies and teams and gave specific methods leader can apply and foster in their team. In case you haven't been following, you can go to our website impact-vc.com, and there you find all parts in our forum section. In this final episode, we will be dealing with inner organizational distances, their effects and possible ways for leaders to deal with them. For this, we best start to explain what we mean when we talk about internal distances, and also to look what we mean when we talk of an organization. What do we mean by inner organizational distances? Internal organizational structures are the result of decisions taken at the outset and all along the expansion of the company. Work has to be divided up, chains of actions defined, and roles and functions attributed to these. Finally, procedures have to be installed to ensure the reintegration of the divided up steps. Established structures are easily perceived as natural and the one and only option to organize things, but as everybody in the field is aware, there is no one or best way to organize a company. There are always several options to structure a company. Each of the structural forms, whether it is along functional lines or product lines, whether it is single dimension or matrix, whether it is centralized or decentralized, whether it operates with an international unit or integrates international business into all functions, all these have their advantages as well as their drawbacks. Structures have effects, obviously. They are exactly introduced for that purpose, for example, to assign different tasks to different roles, as well as roles to people. All this is aimed at the fundamental goal to achieve results and finally realize profits. Structures, in fact, shape proximities and distances. The operational and formal setup of each organization forms proximities and distances. So, for example, structures decide who gets which sort of information in which form and at what point, who has access to whom by what means, who decides with whom, who participates at what point, who collaborates with whom, who will communicate with whom directly or indirectly or not at all, who interacts with whom in what manner, either in a one-way or reciprocal manner, and also who reports to whom. Structures are in fact a whole system of defined interactions and relations of everybody in the company towards each other. Thus, companies are formal setups of interactions. These distances and proximities are not identical with geographical distances. Members of the company in the same location or geographically very close locations can, in fact, from this point of view, be very distant from each other. And in the same way, geographically very distant members of the company can be very close concerning their availability for each other, their participation in decision processes, and and their accessibility for each other. When companies grow, their structures become more complex. They develop subsystems, like, for example, new roles, divisions, functions, or multiple axes of management or product lines. These are not necessarily related to one another and yet have to work together. Subsystems specialize and work along their own special logic. These can be professional rationalities, think for example of engineers or marketing specialists, functional rationalities or product logics. Finance departments and HR departments do not necessarily share the same logic, nor do sales and development. In this sense, subsystems can each be a tiny universe of their own, which is also meant when the talk is about silos. Each part of the overall system is dependent on the others and cannot function optimally without them. And of course, the company purpose cannot be reached otherwise. And not only do all the parts of the system depend on one another to fulfill the company purpose, but in addition, the interplay of all actors becomes more and more multifarious and less traceable. Also, companies consist of a multiplicity of stakeholders. Stakeholders are people who have an interest in specific outcomes. Multiple stakeholders have multiple goals and interests, so to act in concert might not be the standard procedure in organizations. And more dilemmas arise. A dilemma means that in a given situation or decision, there is more than one legitimate goal which has to be attained, but both objectives cannot be reached at the same time. As somebody put it, companies are manufacturers of dilemmas. So, in a parallel process, companies grow in size and complexity. So, what happens when companies go international? Operating in a new country means operating in a so far unknown environment. There is a new market with new dynamics, different regulations like tax, law, or social security, or different labor regulations. The company has to adapt to a new culture, handle work over different time zones, has to deal with different languages, and probably in constant remoteness. So, operating internationally adds challenges of quite a different character compared to those known before. Going international is in fact a leap in complexity, even if the expansion into the international sphere does not necessarily mean substantial growth in size. A suitable image of what a company is could be this one. It is at the same time a limited system as well as open to the outside. It is a functioning entity with highly developed and differentiated internal substructures. These are more strongly connected to each other than with colleagues from other substructures, but at the same time they are all highly interdependent with each other. And there are an enormous amount of interactions. And what is very important here to point out, it is complex, but it is not chaos. It is well conceived and well structured, although, as was pointed out earlier, there are no structural setups that are without drawbacks. It all might feel chaotic, and it is inscrutable at times. This is a view of companies as a system. It is a systemic view of organizations. But your view of what a company is, or what your company is, and how you expect processes and people to function might be quite different. Thinking, for instance, of companies as machines is a view very much en vogue since the day of Frederick Taylor right until today. At the heart of this view is the conviction that companies function according to an input-output model. Staff and leaders supply the input, processes are put in place to transform that input into the desired outcome, the output. It is a linear model where when things do not go in the right direction, one either changes the input or the processes. Predictability is a key belief of the machine model of organizations, as well as the assumption that happenings and events can be understood as linear cause-effect chains. We all know from experience that the mechanistic functioning of companies or other organizations is not always what happens in everyday operations. Unpredicted events, unpredicted reactions, unforeseen complications, forces pulling in different directions, unavailable resources are as much of a daily occurrence as smoothly running processes and interactions. Instead, you might know frequent instances when the diverse rationalities are incomprehensible, motives and interests are not easy to decipher, actions you take result in unintended consequences, issues unexpectedly spiral, you lose track of the turns of a process of which you thought it would be rather straightforward, and it is hard to see a clear path to get issues moved and problems resolved. These are leading to increasing impatience or disbelief, mutual recriminations and tensions, as well as a decreasing sense of manageability. So, what's to be done about all this? Internal distances and proximities are inevitable in large organizations in general and in international companies specifically. So it cannot be the aim to generally decrease internal distances. That would be impossible and pointless. Companies need structures, and the more advanced in size and complexity, the more distances emerge. It is worth looking at organizational distances, though, with a lens of where distances are functional or where they are dysfunctional. Functional means that something works well. Its various parts interact efficiently to complete a specific task. It means a way of doing things that achieves the aim, outcome or purpose intended with the appropriate resources. Functional means taking the appropriate action, taking things forward, progressing stalled actions with keeping track of the outcome, fluidifying problems towards ways forward. Obviously, when something is dysfunctional, it does not work efficiently. It performs in an impaired or incomplete way. The question is, where do structural setups create distances that in consequence lead to reduced efficiency? Where do they impede necessary interactions and make things slower? Where do they hold up problem solving in everyday operational procedures, or, for instance, exclude vital stakeholders, which defined communication and cooperation paths are not sufficient to respond to a specific problem-solving challenge? Interacting for results changes the perspective. Interacting for results focuses on taking the daily frictions, irrationalities, contradictions and mishaps as the starting point to shape the necessary interaction with the necessary internal communication partners. These can be colleagues on a lateral or a vertical level. The question is, who needs to talk with whom, in which sequence or together, and about what, in order to solve the problems at hand? Who are the right people to solve the problem and to move the process along in the right direction? The task at hand is to create interaction designs suitable for the problem at hand. For leaders, moving towards such a mode of operation starts from the insight that every part of the company and every party that is involved in a process reflects a different perspective of the whole. And it starts from the understanding that integrating these different perspectives is the most functional way to go forward. It means operating and leading with a situational and flexible process orientation, and empower your team to act in this way, like giving incentives for knowledge sharing, authorizing a solve problem first attitude, but it also means enhancing personal accountability as well as fostering horizontal and vertical coordination and foster communication across stakeholders. This all could also mean that you have to encourage the readiness to take communication risks. Since changes you sanction in your sphere of responsibility will not change the way other sections, units, teams, or divisions act. If you consider it desirable that it causes ripples effect on the internal company environment beyond your team, you might want to include your leadership peers as well as your proper hierarchy in the effort, so that the different parts of the organization can grapple with the inevitable systemic dynamics of your company, work together to create value and create synergies between your subsystems. The question now remains how to talk and about what. There are ways this can be done that are more effective than others. Getting together the right people could be the solution in itself. The participants willing and happy to move forward to eradicate what has hitherto been stumbling blocks. But there's also a chance that this is not as naturally achieved. If the meeting turns out to be an arena for everybody to state their position and, if necessary, in a repeated manner, it might be good to change tack and to consider what exactly you will be talking about and in what way. The first suggestion is to distinguish between the person, in this case your colleagues, and his or her role and function. As we've said, companies design structures, functions and roles. The roles are taken up by employees who are paid for adhering to the attributed task, rules and behavioral expectations. In this way, roles and functions are personalized. In case of upcoming frictions or conflicts, these employees, or you could also say role and function holders, act as representatives of the responsibilities of the respective roles. Of course, this mingles with a person's personality. Still, it is important and very helpful in interactions to make this distinction, because it sets the table, so to speak, for reasoned discussion about the difficulties at hand, instead of getting heated up about your colleagues and their apparent incapacity to see the point. Everybody involved does stand for a specific perspective with its inherent specific mission. To find out what you need to talk about, you need an insight into where your colleagues stand, an insight into what their perspective on the problem is, their constraints and objectives, as well as their mode of thinking. The important point in these suggestions is that you do one step after the other. So the second point is a structuring step as well, and it is important. You separate it from discussing and finding solutions. So the first thing you do is try to understand the perspectives of your colleagues. Once you've done that, you can use tools and techniques to generate and negotiate solutions. And again, do it one step after the other. It is important that you first look for options and you take your time doing that before you start discussing and evaluating them. In this way, you open path to integrate multitudes. In complex organizations like international companies, these leadership and team competencies are key and will be more so in future. Learn, as someone put it, to dance with the mechanisms and dynamics of your company. This is the end of this last part, and this is the end of our series. Thank you for listening. We hope you were able to relate to those aspects of leading at a distance covered in this series, and that you are motivated to try out paths we suggested. We're happy to receive your comments by email or on the comments section of our forum pages. For those of you who would like to discuss a specific situation you're experiencing or anticipating in your remote leadership, a 30-minute free coaching session is available to reach more clarity and define the next move. In case you are confronted with a conflictual situation, we offer a clearing session in which we will analyze with you what could be the next step towards a conflict resolution. For both options, you can book your sessions here.